many of you are familiar with the Lee Story family over in San Francisco? So about half of the room is familiar. So for those of you who are not familiar, the Lee family is a Chinese immigrant family who have lived and worked in San Francisco for over 3 decades. And now they're seniors, and now they're taking care of their disabled daughter. And in late September, they were under threat of eviction. Because of this, they actually decided to take a stand with community organizations. And on the 27th of September, community groups, dozens of families and friends, elected officials came and stood by in unity with the Lee family. The result of this action was a postponement of their eviction for 12 more days. Although this is less of a burden than what they would have if they had to move immediately, there's still a lot of unanswered questions left, such as, will they find new housing after 12 days? Will the housing be affordable? Will it be of quality? Will it provide them with the services and amenities that they need in their old age or that their disabled daughter needs? And most importantly, will it allow them to safely age in place and live with dignity? So, the Lee family represents just one of the many faces in this broader struggle of displacement. We're just going to expand the scope a little bit to San Francisco. And this is a chart that shows the amount of LSAC evictions that have taken place in San Francisco over the past 16 years. According to the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, over the course from 1997 to 2013, there were over 3,705 LSAC evictions. And the underlying point, the reason why I'm sharing this story, is that we can see that from just one city, from just one type of threat that causes people to forcefully move out of their homes, it affects thousands of people, and therefore changes and has the potential to uproot whole neighborhoods and whole communities. If we want to just look at the next slide, we're going to expand our scope even further out and to look at the region. This map shows the Black migration and movement over the past 10 years using data from the 2010 census. And so you can see from this illustration on the left side where the metropolitan hubs, urban developed areas where there are access to amenities and where those areas and neighborhoods have become more attractive to people, the percentages of Black families and individuals has decreased by an average of 20%. And these families are normally moderate to low income. And on the parallel side to that, in the suburbs, in Antioch, in Tracy, and in Brentwood, you see an average of 100 to 500% of increase in the Black population. Now, this is a slide that illustrates the uneven impact, but it's difficult to say that all of this was a cause from involuntary displacement. But we can correlate and fill in the blanks and create our own narrative by looking at what happened during that 10-year period. So in 2001, we experienced a financial crisis, and many low and moderate income families were impacted. Again in 2008 with the housing bubble burst, and concurrently and most recently with the tech hub moving to San Francisco and impacting the neighborhoods and communities adjacent to them. Now, the other flip side of that is the aspect of voluntary displacement. So many first-time homebuyers saw it as their chance leading up to 2008 to move to a better neighborhood with better schools, with more access to amenities, and that are safer. And so during the same time, the explanation of the move to the suburbs can also be taken to see that it was because of voluntary displacement. But at the same time, the tragedy with that move as well is that many of those same first-time home buyers were also the ones that were at risk when the 2008 housing bubble burst. So even though they had moved, they were at risk of repeated displacement. So we've kind of gone over looking at the impacts of displacement on a sliding scale. And so I just want to come up with a brief definition of displacement just so we all have the same vocabulary. So displacement in its simplest sense is when people lose their homes and communities against their will. And it describes a phenomenon when external forces make it impossible for an individual or a family to continue living in their communities or homes. And most explicitly, it's when market forces or public policy, many times in the guise of urban renewal or neighborhood revitalization, actually force people to move out and are replaced by people that are of different color, of a different background, and of a different economic status. And so, most importantly, when we're looking at the solutions later on today, we really do have to look at how the solutions tackle both the market and public policy forces that threaten the displacement of communities. So I just want to give a couple of if-then scenarios about impacts of displacement, because displacement is a very broad definition, and most of us can't have a difficult time identifying and what it looks like in our daily lives. So I'm just going to go through the if statements, and if one of you just wants to shout out really quickly what you assume would be the cause of this action, that would be great. So what happens if a displacee has to resettle nearby in a neighboring community? Does anyone have any ideas? So they're most likely at risk of repeated displacement. So if you move, for example, I think the one that is very tangible to everyone is if you move from San Francisco to Oakland, most likely because Oakland's property prices are increasing, you'll have to move out of Oakland in a few years. The other one is, so what happens if you move really far away? Any guesses? So loss of community? Is there another one?
Transportation.
What is it?
That's the main one, transportation.
Transportation, yes, okay. That's one of our resident leaders. Higher transportation costs to come to the same job that you've been exposed to visit the same family members, and to stay connected to the same community that you've invested and lived in for so long. So what happens if the displacee decides to double up with their family or friends?
No.
Stress, yes. Is there another one? So in circumstances like this, there's a high risk of overcrowding and illegal conversions. In the next scenario, if the displacee moves into a single race, lower income community, what happens then? Quite proud, okay. Okay, so then you risk increasing segregation and the breaking up of the political power of those minority groups. And if the displacee decides to suck it up and takes on the higher cost for related to housing, then they risk the decreasing money left for other necessities like food and healthcare. And lastly, if they can't find anything else at all, then they are at risk of homelessness. So I just want to go briefly over to looking at the history of displacement in the U.S. It's not a new phenomenon in the world or in particular to our culture. And so we can just start with the founding of this great nation in the 17th century with Native Americans. 2 centuries later, with Manifest Destiny in the Southwest. World War II with ethnically Japanese Americans having to go to internment camps. And in the 1950s, through urban renewal, under the guise of urban renewal, Negro rule. And so these 4 examples kind of illustrate the explicit government action that impacts vulnerable populations. I do want to hark back, though, to the modern day examples that I mentioned earlier with the Lee family and within the region, to also say explicitly that there are a ton of market forces that in our current day we need to deal with that make dealing with displacement a little bit more complex. So just as the impacts of displacement are diverse, so are its causes. We mentioned the market forces as well as the public policy decisions, but also just to note, there are a variety of causes, and most of us may not recognize it. So the one that caught my eye the most was the natural disaster with Hurricane Katrina, most recently in New Orleans, and even in the 1930s with the Dust Bowl. So for today, we are just going to focus on 4 of the main causes that we think are most pertinent in our day and time and place here in the Bay Area, which are foreclosures, condo conversions, rent increases, and transit-oriented development. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Jean, who is not in the room. But I can facilitate if you want. Okay.
There she is.
Okay.
So thank you, Dominique, very much. I think that's a helpful framework for the workshop today. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who's going to talk about foreclosures. And that's Peggy Jen with Bay Area List. And I'm just going to give a few sentences about Peggy before she starts and about this. Peggy is on the EBHO board, and she represents Local Initiatives Support Corporation. And LISC helps residents transform communities and neighborhoods into healthy ones, good places to live, to work, and to raise families. And they have a comprehensive community development strategy about investing in people and places, and in particular looking at transportation corridors like International Boulevard to identify places for economic development and affordable housing. So thank you very much, Peggy.
You'll be my clicker. Great, thank you, Dominic. So, thank you for the warm welcome, Jean, and I think it was great to follow Dominique, and she kind of set the framework for what I have to talk about. And I was asked to just kind of talk a little bit about how we got here in terms of the foreclosure crisis, what happened, and how do we move forward and kind of the impact the foreclosure crisis has had in Oakland. Can everyone hear me, or do you need a microphone? Okay, all right. So, Jean graciously talked about my organization, LISC. We are a national nonprofit, and we work throughout the United States. We are in 30 different urban areas as well as in rural communities, and we've seen the foreclosure impact throughout all the sites that we work in, some more devastating than others, but I think every community is experiencing and is trying to recover from it. And part of what we do is we try to work with local communities through training, technical assistance, and financing, so to kind of build the capacity locally to respond to things that happen in their neighborhood. So what caused the foreclosure crisis? Without looking at the screen, what are some of your thoughts around what happened and what caused the tremendous crisis that we're still trying to recover from? Shout out. Thanks. Okay. Greed. I heard greed.
The selling of mortgages.
Selling of mortgages. Sorry? Plain old fraud. I know some of you looked on the slide, but I think a lot of you are responding from personal experiences and stories that you've heard. And I think what's interesting to me as someone who kind of thinks of themselves as a houser, that the context of housing in the U.S., housing is always, to me, seems like it's viewed as a commodity more than it is as shelter, right? When you hear on the news about how well the economy is doing, it's always about housing starts. It's a commodity, it's not shelter for people. So I think that and all the market forces and public policy things that Dominique alluded to led to the foreclosure crisis. All the things that you talked about, there was an increase in what's called subprime loans. Those are loans that are high cost and what's perceived to be high risk. And there's evidence that shows that a lot of that subprime lending was targeted in communities of color, when folks really could have been eligible for what's considered prime loans that are more stable and more reliable financing, that folks were being targeted with these bad financing products. There was a flood of money into the system. So, instead of housing being a shelter, it was a big commodity being traded on Wall Street. And there was a lot of money coming up from a lot of sources, and they had to figure out ways to use that money. So they came up with a lot of financing products that really weren't good for a lot of people. So people talked about fraud that happened. And one of the things I do want to point out that sometimes people try to say that the foreclosure crisis was caused by what's called the Community Reinvestment Act, called CRA, and that's a law that kind of forces banks to invest in low-income communities. There's a lot of studies that show that CRA was not the cause of the foreclosure crisis. That CRA, you know, the types of lending that banks are forced to do with CRA actually probably performed better because those types of products went to nonprofits that did a lot of counseling and support to the folks that they were working with. So to think that legislation that forced banks to do the right thing was the cause of all this crisis is really wrong. So the U.S. Department of Housing was required to do a study to look at what caused the foreclosure crisis, and all the things that you all talked about is what they found. So in short, the market developments in 2000 helped create a self-perpetuating cycle. In pursuit of high profits, lenders and investors poured capital into ever riskier loans. Sorry, I didn't get to print out my notes because I didn't go into the office because of the BART strikes. I'm relying on the You're going forward. There we go. Sorry. So the flood of capital helped to spur rising home prices that masked the riskiness of loans being made, leading to continued loosening of underwriting standards. When house price growth finally slowed in late 2006, the true nature of these risky loans were exposed, and the house of cards came tumbling down. So this is what the federal government said was the root cause of the foreclosure crisis. And I think part of what we want to say is that, you know, sometimes there's people like to blame the borrowers who were exposed to these risky loans. And as we've heard, you know, people were both exposed to it because of fraud, because it was really pushed on it because the system needed to have money flow through. And a lot of it was, you know, people really wanted to reach the American dream, right? They wanted to be able to buy a house. And so I think a lot of folks were taken advantage of because they were presented with these loans that sometimes were not in their best interest, that looked like it was a good deal that they can participate and participate. I got my 30-second flash. So what I want to do is just flash forward to kind of, I'm not going through all the, let's go to the map, don't we? The one thing that Jane and Dominique asked me to talk about was some of the impacts in Oakland. And I think all of you have experienced the impacts in Oakland and know about the impacts in Oakland, about the loss of the displacement of families, the stress it has on the health of the community and individuals in the community, the blight that you see, the housing prices that dropped, so that folks that lived in Oakland lost a lot of their equity in the homes that they invested in. The other result that we saw, and this is through work from the Urban Strategies Council, was that a lot of investors came in and bought large lots of properties to take advantage of the low prices. And so this map shows all the foreclosures that took place in 2007 and through 2011, and you see all the foreclosures kind of concentrated in some of the communities of color and low-income communities. And then the next map shows where Urban Strategies found a lot of investors purchasing properties. And I want to point this out because this has also kind of, this is kind of one of the next steps that we all face in terms of what happens, one of the lingering effects of the foreclosure crisis. What's going to happen with these properties when the investors, when prices go up and they want to recover their investment? We could be faced with another kind of wave of potential displacement. We can see the same type of destabilizing effects that we saw when the immediate foreclosure crisis hit. So why does it matter? you know, foreclosure and the lingering effects of it has just had such a detrimental effect in the communities and in our neighbors. And I think what we want to talk about throughout this afternoon and further is what are some of the different strategies to help prevent the displacement that's happening.
Before I introduce our next speaker, I just wanted to note, we really want to hear from you. I know that people are going to have questions, and there should have been a note card and maybe a pencil on or adjacent to your chair. So please just note them, and we'll make sure we ask them at the end of the program. Our next speaker is going to be talking about condo conversions. I'd like to introduce Elissa Dennis. Elissa is a long-term EBHO advocate and member and affordable housing professional with community economics and Oakland resident. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks. This one?
It's on.
This one?
Yeah.
I don't know, let me this. Humor these folks. Okay, so I'm going to do a pretty Oakland-centric presentation about condo conversions and what's happened in the history and current history, recent history of how condo conversions have been used to displace people here in Oakland. So just quickly, where did condos come from? I had to look this up myself, but condos was first came about in the United States as a form of ownership back in the 1960s. It really grew a lot in the 1970s, particularly in places like California, where house prices were skyrocketing. And so condominiums became a less expensive way for folks to get into the housing market. And what happened, which is fine, which is great, what happened in Oakland through the 70s and into the early 80s that caused a lot of concern was that a lot of apartment buildings were suddenly being converted to condos without anybody doing anything about it or anybody paying any fees or having any repercussions. And this particularly was happening in certain areas. I know you can't really see this, but this is the lake right here, right? And so the area around Lake Merritt, on both sides of Lake Merritt, and then up Broadway, that line is Broadway. And this is kind of is what became termed the impact area. This is an area that folks became most concerned about because huge numbers of apartment buildings were turning into condos. So what happened was in the 1980s there was an ordinance and then a couple of variations or modifications to it. But what evolved was that in that impact area that was on the previous slide, there's a primary area and a secondary area. An ordinance came into place that prohibited conversions in those areas, in those impact areas, without one-for-one replacement. So in order to convert an apartment building, your apartment building, into a condominium building, you'd have to either build a new apartment building to replace it or buy conversion credits from somebody else who was building an apartment building. But there were a couple problems. One is that the major impact, the major effect of the ordinance was just in the impact areas. The rest of the city were left out. And the rest of the city, the ordinance only affected buildings of 5 units or more. So buildings of 1 to 4 units were left out of the ordinance. Another problem is that you could buy these conversion credits from somebody else who's got an apartment building. Well, that would be fine, except for, who's building a new apartment building. That would be fine, except for the fact that somebody could build a condo building, have it all set up for condos, and say, okay, I'm going to rent this for 7 years. And then they can sell you their conversion credit. So you can convert your building, take the apartments off the market and turn them into condos, and then somebody else over here, well, there's a new rental, isn't that great? Well, what happens 7 years later, right? So the 2 to 4s became a problem. Those are the two big problems. There's the 2 to 4 unit buildings are left out, and a fully 1/4 of the rental housing stock in Oakland is in 2 to 4 unit buildings. As many of you probably know, walking around your neighborhoods, Oakland doesn't have that big urban, huge apartment buildings. Oakland has a lot of small 2 to 4 unit buildings. In my neighborhood, which is kind of just a couple miles up from here, sort of the Laurel neighborhood, most buildings, it's not a very kind of an odd light, but you can see that this is the kind of building that exists in my neighborhood. It's got 3 units, it's kind of got this, it's kind of built in the 60s and isn't particularly attractive, but it's 3 apartments, right? And so this is something that actually I'm worried about right now down the street from me, because somebody recently bought it, moved into it, which means that she can evict the 2 other people, and I'm concerned that she's going to look to convert it. And what happened was, in 2006 to 2009 or so, a lot of buildings that looked like the one in the previous picture got a coat of paint, got a new little piece of granite countertop, got some kind of really little thing on the roof line, and people who were paying, you know, $1,000 a month for rent, $900 a month for rent, were told, oh, do you want to buy this? It will only cost you $350,000, right? So here's what happened. During the real estate boom from sort of 06 through 09 through 010, Oakland lost about 800 to 1,000 units of apartments, rental housing apartments, throughout the city, but particularly in certain pockets, like in my neighborhood in Laurel and in parts of North Oakland. And the folks transitioned, right? The folks who were paying rent were paying $900, $1,000, $1,100 a month rent. Not that, you know, not cheap, but they were, you know, relatively affordable to folks in the $40,000, $50,000 a year category. All of a sudden, when the landlord came in and said, "Oh, do you want to buy the building?" Well, those people could. You buy the unit that you're living in. Those people could. You can't take your $900 a month and go get a mortgage for $300,000, right? So you have what a lot of folks portrayed as, well, this is a great opportunity to first-time home buyers, right? Folks from San Francisco were coming into my neighborhood. They were looking for houses. The houses were $600,000. Well, here you go, right? You can get into this nice, you know, rehabbed, painted, pretty, colorful condo for $350,000, $375,000, $400,000. But you need a down payment, right? And you need a monthly rent, housing payment of about double, 2 to 3 times what your payment was before. So you had this huge transition. You had this huge dramatic lack or removal of the economic diversity and all the other diversities that follow in these neighborhoods that transition from one piece to the other. So I'll end here and we'll pick back up on the solutions.
Thank you, Elissa. Don Phillips is our next presenter, and Don is with Casa Justa Just Cause. For those of you who aren't familiar, CJJC is a multiracial grassroots organization building community leadership to achieve justice in Oakland and San Francisco. And in particular, they've been fighting for tenants' rights and advocacy, and really leading some of the local campaigns here on the ground around affordable housing issues. Thank you, Don.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Wait, is it better? All right. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. So, like Jean said, my name is Dawn, and I'm with Casa Justa. We have so little time to talk about so many things. I'm not going to say anything more about my organization. I put some newspapers on the sign-in table, and folks can always come and talk to me about it. So this afternoon, I'm going to try to talk about 3 points in this section. One is I'm going to actually try to define gentrification. And the reason I'm going to do that is because at my organization, we think that gentrification is actually the root cause of displacement. So what we see every day in the neighborhoods is displacement. We see the people that we know who've been our neighbors for a long time. We see our family members, etc., pushed out of the neighborhoods, out of the city. But really, what drives that displacement fundamentally is gentrification. So I'm going to come back to that in a second. So one, I'm going to try to say what that is. And why does this process end up resulting in displacement for so many of the people that we know? And then secondly, I'm going to say why gentrification is important in the Bay Area in general. And then I'm going to swing around to talk about why gentrification is such a big issue for Oakland renters, which is kind of what the folks at EBHO asked me to talk a little bit about, is kind of the impact of gentrification and displacement on renters. So, my 3 points. So first, I'm going to start a little bit with a definition. This is a definition that we use at our organization. So it says that gentrification is a profit-driven race and class remake of urban working-class communities of color that have suffered from a history of disinvestment and abandonment. There are lots of ideas in there, but the key things I want to say about this is that in order for there to be the displacement that we see today, there has to be a long history in our neighborhoods to set the condition for this displacement. In most of our neighborhoods, these conditions were anywhere from 50 to 60 to 65 years in the making. right? They included a lack of, when federal funding got cut from the neighborhoods, when schools got disinvested, when neighborhoods got redeveloped, quote unquote. So there's a long history of making first the neighborhoods the only places that black and brown people could live in the cities or in these neighborhoods, right? Because of all the things that led up to it, redlining, all kinds of housing segregation. So there was a whole set of conditions that got created. Then people basically had to be concentrated in the neighborhoods that we know, West Oakland, East Oakland, before that even North Oakland, right? And now it's kind of moving east. You go north, you go west, and then now you're seeing more folks of color in East Oakland. But basically, all these historic conditions basically lead to like racially segregated neighborhoods of communities of color mostly. And then, as the real estate market and as the housing market, as people have said before me, started getting very valuable, land and housing became very valuable and very expensive, then neighborhoods started feeling a lot of this pressure, and so old residents, long-time residents get pushed out, right? So this is a slide that there's no way you can digest. I can barely explain it. There's so many, but what this is that this shows about how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different things that go into causing gentrification. I'm just going to highlight a few to give you an idea. So I've been talking about the disinvestment. So that looks like the top left, reduced federal support for urban programs. We've talked about, and Peggy talked about it, the way in which land and housing are becoming, and Elissa too, so capital moves from stocks to land, so land and housing actually becomes the way that people make a lot of profit. Okay. There's a whole lot of factors that go into creating gentrification. So, why does gentrification matter to the Bay Area? So there's a lot of facts. So I'm gonna just talk over as Dominic flashes the next couple of slides. But firstly, the Bay Area is anticipated to have a whole lot of growth in the next 30 years. There's growth in the number of people who are going to be moving into the Bay Area. They're saying something like 9.3 million new people. There's a whole bunch of jobs that are supposed to be created, and there's a whole lot of homes that are supposed to be built. So this is another hard to read slide. It shows basically what I just said, that in jobs, in housing, and in population, the Bay Area is going to grow tremendously in the next 30 years. This one shows how much here in Alameda County and Oakland alone, how much investment of money there's going to be. So you see Alameda's on the top, $63 million are expected. So a lot of our neighborhoods went from a long history where no money got put into our neighborhoods to now a bunch of money, a bunch of people, it's all gonna come crashing into our neighborhoods really, really quickly, whether we want it or not. Next slide. So why is this an issue? So basically, there's a real threat that as our neighborhoods go from being underinvested to highly invested, that racial inequalities are going to intensify. Next slide. So one of the things that you see in this chart, and that other speakers have already talked about, is the issue of black displacement from Oakland. Very, very serious issue, and you see by the federal regulation agency's own numbers, black displacement is going to increase. So it's not going to get better; it's going to get worse for black people. Okay. So actually back. One more. Okay. So you see in this slide, it says that San Francisco and Oakland now are number 1 and number 2 in the country, highest rent increases. We're going to come back to that next slide. Okay, so why does gentrification matter to Oakland renters? All right, next slide. So one, Oakland is a majority renter city. 59% of all residents are renters. Now this is an important part. 80% of all the renters live in structures that were built before 1980. So this is old housing, kind of what Elissa was talking about for the types of housing that we all know and see in the neighborhood. A family has to work 3.5 full-time minimum wage jobs to afford a 2-bedroom unit in Oakland, and 52% of Oakland households are considered to be very low or low income. Now this, you put it beside the fact that 34% of East Oakland residents alone are unemployed. Okay, next slide. So why is this, so what's this slide? This slide shows the very low and low income population and how much housing is going to be built for that population. So you see the need is great. The need is on the left side, right? So we got 34% needed very low income housing. They're probably gonna only be able to build 10%. What happens to the 24% of people who don't go from needing it to getting into it? What happens? Yeah, that's right. Okay, next slide. So the cost of a 1-bedroom apartment in Oakland is average right now $1,700. It's a 20.1% increase from last year alone. Okay, next slide. So there's been a lot of problems with rising rent. So one of the ways that you track this is that there's been a 71% increase in complaints to the Oakland Rent Adjustment Program. So people have been complaining about 2 things. One, unjustified rent increases. Landlords who basically are lying to get more rent out of people. That's what an unjustified rent increase is. And secondly, inadequate services. So they don't come around and fix the sink. They don't fix the toilet. You live without heat, no water in your shower. Next slide. So as you see, this is a really, really serious condition. Oakland renters are already highly threatened, at risk of displacement, and you put on what's happening, that's projected growth and development in the Bay, and you got a serious problem for Oakland renters.
Thank you so much, John. So our next presenter is Jeff Levin. Jeff is the policy director at EBHO and is an affordable housing expert, I would say nationwide, and recently retired from the city of Oakland after almost maybe more than 30 years of being a housing expert there. So thanks, Jeff.
Good afternoon, everybody. And actually what I want to talk about today around transit-oriented development, I think tags on very nicely Dawn's presentation on gentrification, because gentrification happens, as Dawn says, when a neighborhood has had disinvestment and property values going down for a long time, and then something happens in the housing market that makes that neighborhood more attractive, and investment comes into that neighborhood, and the housing prices go up. So one of the things we want to look at is what are some of the bigger changes going on in the Bay Area that might be driving gentrification. So in 2013, last summer, the 2 big regional planning agencies, the Association of Bay Area Governments and the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, jointly adopted a new regional plan called Plan Bay Area. This plan is actually required by state law. It is part of California's plans for climate control and reducing greenhouse gases and trying to deal with global warming. And many of the ideas in it are very good, which is instead of having sprawl and people building houses further and further away from jobs, what we really want to see is more compact development where people can live close to transit, close to their jobs, in what we call complete communities. Communities where people don't have to drive everywhere, where you could walk or bike to get to all the things in your neighborhood. That's a very, very promising thing, and from a broad planning standpoint, that makes a lot of sense, and it makes for much livelier communities, but it has a risk to it as well, and that is whether that development is going to be equitable or whether it's primarily going to benefit higher income people at the expense of lower income people. So this map shows the plan is driven by what are called priority development areas. These are areas that cities themselves said, this is where we want to promote more development. And if you look on this map, you can see how concentrated those priority development areas are located in the 3 big cities in the Bay Area, San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose. And where in those cities it's concentrated. So in San Francisco, it's in the eastern neighborhoods like Chinatown, the Mission, Bayview, Hunters Point. In Oakland, it's in the flatland areas. In San Jose, it's in the urban core. These are all neighborhoods with high concentrations of people of color and low-income working people, very much at risk of displacement. 40% of the growth over the next 30 years is supposed to happen in those 3 cities. So the heart of this is what's called transit-oriented development, and we are actually today sitting in a transit-oriented development here at the Fruitvale Station, which is, you know, a complex here which is a mixture of offices and shops and housing and other facilities close to transit. These can be very good things and make for very livable communities. But we have to make sure that they are inclusive, that they're complete communities, and that there is access for people from all economic levels, that we don't displace low-income people in low-income communities, and where these go into higher-income communities, that there's access for low-income people to take advantage of those communities. So that creates some real risks for displacement. And here we're talking about both the risk that people will be driven out of their units and that they'll be driven out of their neighborhoods and their communities altogether. We can talk about both direct and indirect displacement. Direct displacement is when somebody literally buys property and forces the people out. We saw a lot of that with urban renewal in the 50s and 60s as redevelopment agencies bought up property, tore down houses, displaced people, and so on. Probably transit-oriented development will not cause a lot of this, but it will cause some. We have a case in Walnut Creek right now where a private developer is actually buying up some houses that have some lower income Latino families living in them, and they'll be displaced and high income condos will be built instead. Our real concern is around privately owned sites right around those BART stations where there's really not a lot of leverage right now to prevent them from displacing people. We also have the risk of rent increases and condo conversions as those neighborhoods become more attractive. So just quickly, let's run through some in Oakland. Some of the planned transit-oriented development areas: Coliseum City, the area around the Coliseum, all along International Boulevard as we develop bus rapid transit, the Broadway Valdez area in downtown, and the Lake Merritt area around the Lake Merritt BART station. All of these are lower income communities. And so all of these, we will face some real challenges making sure that as we do a kind of development that should be beneficial for everybody, we have to have the right policies in place to make sure that everybody shares in that. And that's what the second half of our presentation is going to talk about. Thank you. Beneficial for everybody.
And we apply and apply and apply and apply into places that they can afford, but they don't make, companies around the lake are monopolizing all these buildings, right? And there are like 3, 4, 5 companies owning all these freaking buildings all over the place. And people want to live in nice places as well. They try to move there, you apply, you send, you bring your application and everything. They just tell you you didn't get it. And the apartment is rented. And none of these people, and I have a bunch of people. I work with 50 people maybe, finding places for them. One of them had got an apartment in the Lake Merritt area, but nobody else. So how do you, anybody knows if there's anybody nobody was checking on the banks. I mean, they say that the subprime loans was that created the 2008 housing bubble to burst. I think it's just the banks. I think it's just Wall Street. It's not nobody else, because nobody was watching them. And it seems like that's happening as well now with renters as well. Nobody's really checking what is the process. What do I do if I feel like this person should have gotten this apartment? And we went they post the ad right now. We go to see it half an hour later. We submit the application 50 minutes later, and we don't get the apartment anywhere.
So the bad news is that there's no regulation that allows that to happen. I mean, what we do know is that there's a history of racial, racial discrimination in housing. And more, why would a landlord rent to someone? I mean, a slide that I didn't include is just how many of Oakland residents pay over 30% of their income for housing. So a lot of landlords don't like the rent. So even if you think you can afford it, if you make $1,200 a month and you think you can afford a $900 a month apartment, people aren't going to rent you when they have someone who's making $4,000 a month. And so So the short of it is, as far as we know, there's no way to regulate that type of behavior on the part of landlords. This is why, it's really, really important and urgent for us to pass more policies, which is the next part of the conversation. But to answer your question, I don't know of any such, I mean, I would encourage you to start keeping a database, track the landlord, track the tenants and who applies, track the demographics of the applicants, and we should start making a case that these are like race and income-based discrimination that people are suffering.
Thank you. Adrian, do you have a question?
Do you know if the Coliseum City project is still going on with all the teams seeming to be trying to leave the city?
The city still believes that it's going to move forward with Coliseum City. They say that they're very close to lining up investors, so they have plans to try and move that project forward, both around the stadium to build housing and retail and all of that around there. And you can just imagine what kind of impact that will have on the surrounding neighborhood. So, what they don't have anymore is the tool of redevelopment. That's been abolished, but the city is still trying very hard to move that project forward, and we need to pay attention to what happens there.
Thank you. I'm gonna move us into the next part of the program just because we're on time. I don't wanna get us off. I'm really excited about our next speaker. We're gonna talk about solutions, right? We've heard some really troubling facts and information, but there are options and then there are actions that we can all participate in to create change around some of these problems that have been presented. One of our partners at EBHO that we work with a lot with pride is ACE. And for those of you who don't know, ACE is the Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment. Some of you might have known them as ACORN in their previous life. And we love them. And they are doing some amazing work on affordable housing, especially around the issue of foreclosures. So Pamela Hall, welcome.
Good afternoon. So she gave a brief bio about me. I am from ACES. It is the Alliance of California Community Empowerment. Empowerment is the important word when you are affiliated with ACES. I was a homeowner that had tried for a modification for about 5 years. I come from 20 years of real estate. I thought I knew everything. I realized I didn't. I had tried local agencies who were doing modifications. I didn't go to attorneys because I had the best attorneys in the real estate company that I work for who had tried for a modification for me, and in the end told me that they couldn't do it. The only way for me to get a modification would be by me doing the work myself. After 5 years of trying other agencies and submitting paperwork and being told the basic things, you didn't get it in time, you make not enough, you make too much, you make this, you do this, you do that. I decided, well, I guess I'm at the end of my rope. When I spoke to a minister of mine, he said, let me give you this lady's number. Give her a call. I bet you'll keep your house. And I'm like, So I called her. She came over, we spoke. She said, you're gonna occupy the bank and you're gonna keep your house. And I said, I'm not going to jail. What are you talking about? Occupying a bank. If you had told me over 2 years ago that I would have gone into a bank and said, take this, I want my house. I want it now, you modify it, take the money off the principal and let me keep it, okay? And they say, okay. No, it wasn't that easy. Anyway, I thought, why not? What did I have to lose? I was at the last step. I didn't have any other directions to go in, so I decided to join ACES. That's when the empowerment came about. I took my piece of paper and I went to the bank, Bank of America, and I said, I need a modification. And one thing about ACES is you have other members who are on the same track as you. It's like a community, it's like a village. You have everybody there who's with you saying, we're gonna support you, Pam, or we're gonna support you, another individual, or come. Give it a try. What do you have to lose? Let me tell you, after 6 months of occupying Bank of America, my house was worth $620,000. With a market bond, my house was worth $50,000.
Oh, wow.
I owed $323,000. My mortgage had went from $2,000 to $6,600. I owed $100,000 plus on my mortgage, and for 5 years they told me to walk away. When I finished, I got a modification of $386,000 taken off completely. 3.88% for the life of my loan. My mortgage is $1147 a month with tax and insurance, and I'm happy. That's what ACE is, that's what empowerment, that's what occupying the banks will do for you. It doesn't work for everyone, and nothing is 100% guaranteed, but it worked for me. Last year, we saved 23 homes. That was occupying a bank. It didn't cost you anything but some time. I actually had fun doing it. You know, listening to all the speakers, all of it has something to do with me. Everything, everyone who spoke, it was me. It's the story of my life. African American, predatory loan. I wasn't a new homeowner. I've been a homeowner for over 10 years. All this has happened to me. If I lost my house, I would have been homeless. There are not places for us to go. When you lose your house, you don't become a renter, you become homeless. That's the reality of it. ACEs, it worked for me. I suggest, if you know of people who are in need of help and the system doesn't work, now I believe in the system because I work both sides of it. But if it hasn't worked for you and you're still fighting, call me. Empowerment, okay? Thanks. Got bailed out. We got sold out. Thank you.
The other thing I just want to mention also is that the city of Oakland has a city trust fund, and we've been working with Pamela and with some other folks in this room around what's called the ROOT program, and really it's identifying solutions to the foreclosure problem in Oakland. And so I encourage you to speak with them about that. And we're going to bring up Elissa to talk about some condo conversion solutions.
Okay, so I'm not sure I can offer quite as much fun as Pam here, but who came today looking for something that they want to plug into right now to get involved in right here in Oakland? Who's going to sign up? All right, good. All right. So here's where we left off, right? We got buildings like this that unfortunately you can't see very well, but you all know the buildings because you all live in North Oakland or East Oakland, right? And most of the rental housing in those neighborhoods is in buildings like this, right? We don't have a lot of big giant buildings to worry about and to organize around. So right now we have about 20,000 renter households who are at risk just because they live in these kind of buildings. It doesn't make sense, right? So if you go to the next slide. So over the years, so in the 1980s, as we talked about before, there was organizing around getting that condo conversion ordinance. That was a good thing. It stopped the conversions that were happening in that impacted area, and it was really positive for maintaining a lot of rental housing and a lot of people in that rental housing. But as we discovered, when the boom in the real estate market happened, there were problems with that. And then all of a sudden, we found that the release valve in the system was these 2 to 4 unit buildings, and people were losing their homes. So we tried to fight it then, EBHO and other tenant advocate organizations. But what happened was, the bad guys, the guys who were out there, the realtors and the developers who were out there making money on these conversions, they weren't happy enough just trying to convert the 2 to 4 unit buildings. They wanted to convert bigger buildings. So we ended up having to be, sort of fight a defensive posture back in that era when they wanted to loosen up the condo conversion ordinance altogether and allow more and more conversions, not just in the 2 to 4 unit buildings, but in larger buildings as well. So we've kind of been delayed a little bit in being able to make progress while we've had to fight back efforts to further loosen and to further weaken the ordinance. So what we're trying to do now, and what happened back then as well, was that there were efforts to get inclusionary zoning policies, and it became all these task forces. This was during the Dellums administration, where everything was task forces and everything was blue ribbon commissions and everything was discussing, and the only way anything was going to get done was if some elaborate package happened where like everybody got something that they wanted, and of course no one ever got anything that they wanted out of that. So what we're trying to do now is to focus on our priorities. Which is mainly to protect, to get those 2 to 4 unit buildings, which are still happening in many neighborhoods. The boom isn't happening, so the rate of conversions has slowed down, but that could be a very good time to actually get some improvements in the ordinance, right? Because there aren't a lot of people out there right this minute making money off these conversions. But it's still happening, there's still a trickle of them happening, and it still could happen obviously again as prices start to beat up. So we want to work right now on a priority of the 2 to 4 unit buildings, and also getting rid of this foolish loophole that if you have a building that's rental housing for 7 years, that suddenly becomes a replacement for a building that you're converting to condos. So what we're trying to do right now is we're working with a couple of city council members on an ordinance or on revisions to the existing ordinance that would deal with our 2 priority areas, that would protect the 2 to 4 unit buildings from conversion, and would get rid of that 7-year, make that 7-year rule a much longer period of time, and something has to be rental housing in order to actually count as replacement. And so the approach that these council members are taking right now that we're working with them on is to have a trade-off. And that trade-off would be that a small number, a capped number of, quote, luxury buildings would be able to convert on an annual basis. And so they're talking about maybe 200 a year or 600 over 3 years. And what we're concerned about there is that if we need to define what a luxury building is, first of all. If it's a building that just has higher rents, but might have poor people living in it, that's not useful. You're just trading one group of people at risk for another group. But we feel that if we can keep the number of units to convert per year at a really minimum low number, and if we can define luxury buildings so that it really is people who are high-income people who are living in high-rent buildings, and if we can make sure, most importantly, that there are tenant protections in place, so significantly that low-income people as well as elderly and disabled people would get a lifetime lease. In other words, they'd be able to live in that building if they don't want to buy, and if they're low income, they can't afford to buy, and they're low income. They're in a high income building surrounded by a bunch of rich people, but they happen to be lower income people, that they would have a right to remain as renters under rent control with restricted increases every year, and that would be a mechanism to say, okay, instead of being at risk because you happen to live in a building that only has 3 units, if there has to be somebody at risk, if it's high income people and if there are tenant protections, we think that's a reasonable trade-off, and we think that that's a recipe for success. So right now we're working with council members on it, on forming this ordinance and figuring out how to proceed, and we're trying to get organizing to happen through this fall, winter, as long as it takes, to actually get this passed. And we think that as opposed to a few years ago when they were trying to throw everything into the mix and open everything up, if we can focus on our priorities with a small trade-off, that we have a route to success. So we're going to have a sign-up sheet, I think, of some sort in the back, and please sign up if you want to be involved in this EBHO campaign that's getting going now, and we really want you to participate, and that's how we're going to win. Yeah.
So Don's going to talk about some solutions for tenant protections.
Oh, right on. All right, so talking about solutions. Well, firstly, we have this thing we always say, we're like, you can't solve a problem until you know what causes it. So towards that goal, I would say that the first thing for pushing back against gentrification is you have to first have a clear understanding of what it is. And if we think or we witness that gentrification causes displacement, then we need to understand what gentrification is. The second thing is, we think that just in terms of the whole question of development, there has to be a new approach. So how many people have heard, you know, the kind of argument that, you know, for a city like Oakland, we're really, really lucky. If anyone wants to come and build some housing in our city, if they want to put a car dealership, anyone who wants to locate any kind of housing or business, we got to bend over backwards, and no matter what they want and what they ask, we better go ahead and work with them, because we're just lucky to get anything.
Yes.
Okay, we've been ignored and looked over for so long that we're like that person at the dance. It's like 1:35 a.m. You're at the club, and nobody asked you to dance yet. Okay, sometimes it feels like that's how our city feels like. And we, as people who live in the city, we're told that, listen, you can't be picky. Don't be choosy, and if this project ends up costing Oakland residents way more than we're ever going to get back for it, that's still okay. At least we're going to go home and say, somebody dance with us. Okay? So that's one model of development. That's the one that we've been seeing in Oakland a lot. Okay? Another model of development is the historical one. What we were seeing in like the 60s, the 70s, through the 80s and 90s, when everything got boarded up. Everything that was here moved out, right? Everything shut down. So that's another model. The model of nothing, right? Is just attrition, loss over time. The things that you used to have, you don't have anymore. Okay? Now, we need a third model. So at our organization, we've been talking about this model we call a model of development called human development. So we're saying that, look, who knows better than the people who've been living in our neighborhoods that we want things to get better? Somehow there's a perception that if you live in East Oakland or something like that, that you like it there. That you're perfectly fine and down with what's happening. No, people in East Oakland want things to get better for East Oakland. But they don't want it to get better in such a way that it displaces the very people who live there and replace it with new people. Right? So the kind of development you bring into a community has to speak to the needs of the long-time residents and people who've been living there a long time. So we call that human development. So we need to shift the development approach and the development model. We just can't be that person you know, that takes everything. Thirdly, we like Pam said, we got to focus on organizing, because the process of development has everything to do with, like, I mean, and pardon me, I'm going to just say the word, and I think people understand, it has to do with global capitalism, okay? The decisions that banks make don't get made in Oakland, okay? You know who foreclosed on a bunch of houses in Oakland? Deutsche Bank, okay? There is not even a branch of Deutsche Bank in Oakland, but Deutsche Bank foreclosed on thousands, tens of thousands of homes and homeowners in Oakland, okay? The decisions about what Deutsche Bank did were made somewhere else so far away you gotta take an airplane. Okay. Bank of America is not any more accessible to us here in Oakland than Deutsche Bank is, okay? So we have to organize, because all the time we're up against systems that are larger and bigger, right? And the only way playing by the rules doesn't work. Just like Pam says, sometimes you gotta make your own rules, okay? So we gotta organize. Lastly, we have to make sure that long-term residents and low-income people, that they are at the center of planning and development. The last people, you know, I live in District 6, and I live in East Oakland, okay? I feel like I'm the last person to know what's happening in my neighborhood, okay? And sometimes they send you one piece of letter that says, there's a planning committee meeting, blah, 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 there's a project coming to the Coliseum or something. I feel like we're the last to know. I feel like we're the last to know. We have to be the first to know. Next slide. So quickly, there are some concrete strategies for how you fight to, if you're a renter or a tenant. we have to know our rights. The good news is that in Oakland, people have fought over the years, and there's actually some rights. I don't have time to tell you about it, but if you think you're having a problem with your landlord, come talk to me, because you actually have some rights. Not a whole lot, but some good ones. So the few that we have, let's use them, okay? So secondly, we gotta fight rent increases. It's been said over and over again, prices are going up. You know what, you can stop this. It's not just something that happens somewhere else and we don't have any say about it. We need to do something. If we don't like how rents are going up, we need to do something about it, and we can. Come talk to me, I'll tell you what we're doing about it. Thirdly, we have to improve the housing stock. Okay, so as Elissa said, and I showed in my slide, most of the housing that's privately owned is really old housing stock. Both because the housing stock is old and because landlords let the buildings go to a bad place. It starts with the letter H and has 4 words in it. We cannot just live in buildings that have no heat, no mold, and all these cockroaches. No, we have to fight for better housing conditions. And lastly, we have to fight evictions. Okay, so then in the medium, we got to build a movement. We got to build a movement here in California, because we can't, no time to talk about it, but there are actually some laws here in California that make it bad for tenants in the state. So there's not just local laws, there's state laws. We gotta do something about those state laws. They're not good for us. And then we have to build a national movement, because you know what? I don't know what the rest of you think, but I believe that the federal government has a right and has a responsibility to provide housing for the people. Okay. We pay taxes. We live in the city. We live in this country. They need to provide housing. The federal government has a right. We need to hold them accountable to that work. Last slide. So then, lastly, what we need to do is we need to develop some housing, some types of housing that don't rely on landlords. Right. Or banks. So I'm going to stand up for this. We're going to take landlords and banks out of the equation. We should own our own houses. If 5 people live in a 5-unit building, that should be there. They should own 1/5 of that housing. Why do we need a landlord? If you live in your home and you've been living in that home for 20 years and you've helped build up the neighborhood, why do you need a bank? Who knows better? Does the bank in New York or the Netherlands know better than what we need for our neighborhoods? No. We need to build models where the landlords and the banks are out of business. Okay?
One more presentation, Karen, and we'll take questions. I'm actually really pleased to introduce Gloria Bruce, who is also an affordable housing expert and is currently the interim executive director at East Bay Housing Organization.
Wow, I don't know about you all, but I just feel like I have been in a college course on this person, one of those good college courses where you actually want to go and talk to the professor afterwards and have a instead of falling asleep during it. I mean, it's been amazing, and I almost feel like we need a part 2 to deconstruct and debate and talk so much about what we learned today. Thank you, Karen. Carry me back there. So, really amazing stuff. I'm going to pick up where Jeff left off on some of the transit-oriented development pieces, but hopefully weave in a lot of what we've all been talking about today, and then let you get to all those questions that I know you've probably been dying to ask. And let me also just say, too, that just in case, because of today's transportation situation, I may have to leave just a bit early during the Q&A to pick up my son, so if I do, I wanted to say in advance, thanks to Dominique and the EBHO staff and all the experts in the room putting this together, and hope you all thought it was really good. When I say all the experts in the room, I don't just mean those of us up here, I mean all of you, because as I hear from your responses, everybody here, unfortunately, is a personal expert on displacement, and that's why this matters so very much. So, with no further ado, let me just touch on a couple of things about transit-oriented development, TOD. Now, as Jeff mentioned before, there are some things about TOD that can be inherently great for low-income, middle-income communities. There's potential to make it work really well. And so what I'm going to talk about is making TOD equitable, making it fair, making it have a level playing field. So TOD done right can be very powerful. done without protections, it can be a real challenge, as you've heard before. So you can't really see what this map is up here, but I just wanted to throw this up here and let you know this is a map from the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, over in Minnesota. And I just wanted to put this up here and let you know this, of course, is a national problem. People working on this all over, where there's a central corridor project, which is a light rail project running from downtown Minneapolis to downtown St. Paul, running through some very diverse neighborhoods, and there's a huge effort, community-led, foundation, cities, to try to see, can we change the script, and can we make sure that as all this new money follows this new rail line, that the diversity of those communities will be preserved. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. So here's a picture closer to home. Anyone know what this is? Probably not, doesn't exist yet. And probably someone who does know up here in front. But this is a building planned by Bridge Housing, thank you. Bridge Housing, which is a nonprofit affordable housing developer. This is a project they're going to break ground on this Friday at the MacArthur Transit Station. Oh, really?
For a few days.
Of course, that's right. They said they were going to delay it because of what's going on right now. So it's going to break ground soon. At any rate, so this is one thing that's moving, it's going to happen, you're going to see this. This is 90 apartments of low-income housing located right next to a BART station. And I'm going to go put it out there. EBHO and our members, we are in favor of this kind of stuff. This is new affordable housing. It doesn't directly displace anyone. It was built on a parking lot, so it was a home for cars, and now it's going to be homes for 90 families. But as Jeff mentioned before, here's the challenge. So while this doesn't displace anybody, if those of us who build affordable housing, if we are successful in our message, because what we tell people in that beautiful guidebook back there, if you haven't grabbed one, please do, is we say, affordable housing, it's going to enhance your community. It's not going to bring down property values, which is true. It may even increase property values. Well, that's a great argument for community acceptance. But if that's true, then great for the 90 people who are living here, but there may be impacts for the people in surrounding areas. So we need to make more of these, but we have to do other things as well. So, oh goodness, come on. How is that out of order? That's all right. There we go, thank you. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about all of these because I'm getting the pink signs from Anthony there, but just to let you know, we need a lot of policies in place. A couple of them have already been discussed today. So we need to make sure that if new housing is built, there's replacement housing requirements, that people who get displaced have relocation assistance from the city. We need to do a lot more to preserve the affordable housing we already have, whether it's officially subsidized or not. We need to get in there, clean it up, make sure we have things in place to preserve it. Some of that looks like the condo conversion controls that Elissa was talking about. And then, of course, for the vast majority of housing that is controlled by the private market and not by nonprofit developers or public housing authorities, as Don was talking about, rent control and stabilization, just cause for eviction, the types of things. We do have some of that in Oakland, but we need to hold on to it and make it stronger. Taking it to the next level, we also have to look at a lot of policies that we can get in place at the city level. So I'm just going to call out the second one here because I'm running out of time, but value capture strategies. That's a really technical term for what Don described as making sure you can pick who you dance with and say, you know what, I know I've been sitting here all night, but I'm good looking and I'm going to wait. I have that internal beauty that hasn't been seen yet. So what this means is basically we do not hold ourselves or our land cheaply. If the city of Oakland, or any city, I don't want to talk just about Oakland, if any jurisdiction puts public investment into land by, for example, let's say you have a plot of land that was zoned for a commercial 2-story building, and then the government comes in and says, you know what, we're going to now say you can build a 30-story high-rise on this land. If they do that, that's a public investment in the value of that land, and all of that increase in the land shouldn't just go to the developer. Some of it needs to come back to the people, because that increase in land came from public investment. And so that basic principle is what we at EBHO and many of our partners, CJJC, ACE, are working on to try to make sure that all these other things, saying we can charge you a fee if you're going to come in and build commercial development, we're going to charge you a fee to help us pay for housing. We're going to say you need to have a percentage of your housing be affordable. These are some of the things we're working on. Real quick,
So I can't get into all of these, but just to say really quickly that we want to look at both advocacy at the plan level. We can fight through individual projects, but we know that's really hard. So we have to say, if there's a plan for a specific neighborhood, like Lake Merritt, Coliseum City, that plan needs to have policies built into it for the next 25 years, saying some of this housing has to be affordable, there need to be anti-displacement strategies in place. Same thing with housing elements, which are the plans that the city uses to determine their housing policy and zoning for the next number of years. And finally, there's a lot of regional advocacy that we need to do as well. We need to talk to folks like Bart, hi Robert, and and talk to other transit agencies and say, you are sitting on a gold mine with these properties next to transit stations. Let's make sure we put some development requirements on them. Let's also make sure when we have new sources of revenue, like these One Bay Area grants coming out of Plan Bay Area, like potential cap and trade revenues or a new transportation bill, let's make sure cities don't just get that funding for transportation unless they also put in protections for anti-displacement. So those are some of the things, and then just to close on the community power tip that Dawn and Pam have been talking about, I want to point out there's something going on right now in Oakland called the Oakland Sustainable Neighborhoods Initiative for International Boulevard, where community groups, community leaders, several of you are here, and the city are coming together to say, how can we shape an international boulevard that if bus rapid transit comes in, we're all going to be able to share in that benefit. So I encourage you to get involved in that and other efforts. And I've gone way over time, but please talk to me later if you want to hear more. Thanks for being here.
My landlord of 94 years died about a couple of years ago. He had a large portfolio of properties, maybe about 35 or 40, and every last property in that portfolio is going to be sold for cash, including my house. So I'm going to be possibly facing homelessness, dislocation. I don't know what it is, I guess being run out of town, and I'm mad about this, and I want to fight it, and so I came to this meeting to try to ascertain what kind of support I might have to cobble together some kind of strategy. I've written the banks for years asking for enhanced banking services as a low-income citizen of Oakland, But the banks and the corporations, they provide no help to the low income. And once we got Jerry Brown in here, he ignored the poor people, the African-American community, and he went straight to New York City, went to Wall Street, and got all that money, brought all that money back here and unleashed it on our communities. He vetoed zoning rights ordinance, inclusionary zoning ordinance last week. And so, we have no resource other than to get organized and to try to unify. I heard one statistic saying that 52% of Oakland's residents are renters, and well over 50% of Oakland's black residents are renters. So, in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, I think Declaration number 28 is everybody has a right to housing, and I firmly believe in that. I don't want to be pushed out of my 4-bedroom house, 1,500 square feet of storage in the basement, and I raised 7 boys and 1 girl in that house. They all went to college, all graduated, and now the old man's gonna get kicked out in the street. Not gonna have it. I'm gonna fight like hell. We gotta fight, make things right, give our babies stories to tell, and not a one for sale.
Sir, I just want to say we should fight together. So I should tell you how to contact us. And I just want to tell everybody, a change of ownership is not a just cause for eviction.
Right.
Okay, so just because the owner of your building or the apartment or the unit that you're renting changes, and they can change it many times, and actually, many of us weren't probably even aware how many times certain properties have changed hands. Except when they do that underhanded illegal thing where they send you an illegal eviction notice and they say, oh, we have a new owner, and so you gotta go out. No. So there are many questions we can ask. Just because ownership of a property changes hands, it doesn't mean that you're immediately, there's a reason to be evicted. So folks, if you don't remember anything else from today, for your friends and yourself and your family, if you're a renter, they can change the ownership of the building. It does not mean you immediately have to be evicted. So, sir, we should talk after. I should tell you how to get in touch with us, but we should fight together.
Do we have any other questions? I want to thank you so much for spending this afternoon with us. Okay, one right here. Yeah.
I just wanted to know if anyone had any readily available statistics on how many of the renters in Oakland are first-time renters in the Bay Area, period, or if they've lived in San Francisco specifically, how long they were renting here before.
Thank you.
It doesn't work.
You know what?
Can
you take it over there?
I want to pick up on that question because I think what you hit at, so we don't, no one here is saying, yeah, I have that. And one of the things that's really tricky is that I think most of the people in this room could say that they know displacement is happening and they can tell all these stories about it. And I've had conversations with someone who's talked with the editor of East Bay Express, for example, who says, she can't convince the editor of East Bay Express that displacement is real because it's really hard to get, you can't get statistics that say this person left this apartment because blah, 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 because they were driven out by tech money in San Francisco. That's not what the census does, right? Or when we look at the census statistics that Dominique showed at the beginning, we very clearly see a steep decline in African American populations. The census shows you that, but you have to cobble together this other information to know why that's happening. So I think that the more that we can come together and try to get some more rich data on what's happening and where, the better. And I know that we have some data around that, around the foreclosure crisis. We know, for example, some of the folks who work with Pam at the Oakland Housing Assistance Center, they know that the people who are losing their homes now, as opposed to the vast majority who are losing their homes, say 3-4 years ago, it's people who have been in those homes for 7, 10, 15, 20 years. It is not people who bought those homes in 2006, 2007. So we have data to prove that. So I would just say keep getting those stories because those are really important, and we need to keep working on the data as well.
Yeah. In the back.
I was just saying that there is a group of people that are starting something called the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, where they're just starting to get the data, but they're taking data mostly from San Francisco right now, but then also taking surveys from folks that are being evicted to try and do exactly that, like map out who's being evicted, why, whether it was actually illegal eviction, or whether it was just sort of they were forced out by threatening or got a settlement or whatever, all the different ways that people are being forced out of their places, and then where they're moving to, sort of trying to map out how that's affecting the whole Bay Area. So there's no it's not authoritative, but it is a project that's rolling. It's online.
My question was more so getting at, I have no problem believing that the people who are most affected by displacement and gentrification have lived there long term, but thinking about strategies to counteract gentrification and whatnot, and thinking about how to create allies, a lot of people are, I'm from Michigan, I'm actually from Flint, and Detroit and Flint, some other issues going on. Gentrification, one, but not probably the biggest one right now. And I think that a lot of friends that I have live in San Francisco, but a lot of them are from the Midwest, and a lot of them also live in Oakland. And it's coming here and moving to Oakland because you already know that San Francisco is going to be too expensive. And so I think there are a lot of people who might be moving in who maybe don't have a socio-historical context for what's going on with displacement. And when you talk about engendering a sense of community, it's important to bring these people who might not be a part of the target group into that discussion. And I think it is important to sort of facilitate the sense of community by including people who might be completely ignorant of what's going on. and some woefully ignorant.
Thank you very much. Do you want to say something?
You know, I wanted to just point out to you that in a minute, you will not be able to afford to live in Oakland. Okay? Because Oakland's rent is probably the second highest from San Francisco in the Bay Area right now. There are so many people who come down to the City of Oakland Housing Assistance Center. No, we don't have numbers, but African Americans, I have to say, my coworker is here, who also works for the City of Oakland, and we house the homeless. We look for shelter space. We look for transitional. There is nothing available. Let me tell you how many people come in who have been displaced or from San Francisco coming to Oakland. Not everyone can afford Oakland. Oakland is extremely expensive. We have more people living in the park than ever. We have more people flooding in the doors when we open up in the morning till we have to turn people away in the evening to go home because they don't have any place to go. The colder it gets, the closer it gets to November and December, the worse it's gonna get. And the sad thing about it, I have to say, this is really great information, and it does take a community. The panel has stressed that. But all the units, all the apartments in Oakland that was built prior to 1983 has no rent control. 83 and up has no rent control. So a landlord can do whatever they want to. They know all these people from San Francisco will come in. They're raising their rent sky high to accommodate San Francisco.
Amy, did you have a question? Okay. Hang on, Mamie was next, and after that, Jeannie.
It's just a question I have to ask because I've been walking up and down International Boulevard, making myself look like a fool, right? Because I don't have the answers to the questions that they're asking me, right? But one of my things I can ask is, a lot of people, as we all know, in Oakland are on Section 8. And what I ran into is a lot of people who are saying that they're on Section 8 and now they're receiving letters saying that you got 90 days to move out because we are no longer accepting Section 8. So what's happening to them when they go around, they try to find other places that have Section 8 because they too have gone up on the price. The difference in what Section 8 pays and whatever their co-payment is gotten to the point, it's gotten out of line, they can't afford that. But the fact of it is that they're trying to find more Section 8 places and they can't find them. So I'm saying, everybody's putting everybody between a rock and a hard place when it comes down to housing. I'm saying, I don't even understand the government with the Section 8, okay? I'm just getting really kind of not happy with them, okay? Because so many people are losing out. And as it is, we already have an affordable housing crisis where the waiting is 200, 300, 400 strong, right? So where are these people going to go? And then you want to tell me about some time? Well, hell, if I'm not sorry. If I ain't got a place to stay, then I have a problem, okay? And this is what is going on. And I have, the people that I talk to are people who do have jobs, but the amount is so low, okay? And so they can't move anywhere, but yet still they lose the next activity because somebody said, I'm not accepting anymore. So I'm saying, we need to get in here, open houses, and find out what these y'all doing, okay? Because none of this is making any sense to me. You create one compartment after the other, you get one fixed and he goes another, he goes another.
Maybe Gloria or Don.
So, I mean, so that's right, I'm not gonna repeat absolutely what you said, now, I'm sorry, I should remember your name, but okay. So, two things on that, like, one, that's a federal issue. So we have to organize at the federal level, we can't just organize at the local level, right? So the Section 8 laws are being made at the federal level.
And their sequestration.
Yes.
Right, and as much as there's problems with our government here in Oakland, there's problems with our government in DC. So absolutely, so I think that's one. Secondly, I mean, I think that I just wanna say this quickly. The problem with Section 8 is that Section 8 is a subsidy program for private landlords. Okay? So what it does, as everybody knows, is it takes money so the government gives money, free money, easy money, to a landlord to make up the difference in the cost of rent that between what I can pay and what the landlord says the rent is worth. Section 8 subsidizes landlords. When actually, and it's work with me for 30 seconds, right? It used to be, the government used to build housing for people who were low income. It's called public housing, okay? There's a whole bunch of issues with public housing because of how they dealt with public housing and how they let it go to such a level of disrepair that really no one wants to live there, and a lot of those housing, no one should be living in that housing, right? Public housing has a really, really bad name in this country, rightly so, because it's bad housing, okay? Now, but if the government took the money, instead of subsidizing landlords who don't have an issue with making a lot of money, they should be building housing, building quality housing. You see, so we gotta think, we gotta like totally rethink these programs. Okay? It's true, there's a problem with Section 8, but the real root problem is that the government has taken itself out of the business of providing quality housing for people and instead gone into the business of subsidizing landlords. Stop that.
I just want to tag on it. Dawn's absolutely right. And so what happens is, when the market is soft, landlords are more than happy to take Section 8 to get money. And when the market heats up, they say, we're not taking Section 8, we'll move that cash instead. We need to get laws either locally or in the state, right? There's laws against discrimination for race. There is no law that says that you can't discriminate against somebody based on their source of income or because they've got a Section 8 certificate. That needs to change.
I was gonna ask the same question that she had, and that you guys have talked about, and I was just wondering, and said, who's gonna take, are they gonna have anyone to come in and subsidize, take over Section 8 if they're gonna close it out?
I mean, I don't know what other people know, but like one thing I know is that more and more people are getting their vouchers transferred out of Oakland. I mean, and people probably know people who have just given up here in Oakland. So I know we work with we see a lot of people who are just taking their voucher and asking for it to be transferred. Modesto, Antioch, even further out of state. People are just applying to get the vouchers transferred because they can't find housing. That's right.
They're allowed to come in.
Can we get a round of applause for our panel?